It is wonderful to see you all. I looked at some of the other subjects. I would have loved to have been in the other stuff as well. So thank you for hanging with me. And if you stay with me over the 2 sessions, we're going to build a conversation based on an amazing statement said around the person of Jesus and the life of Jesus. And it's roughly something I just simply call 252, based on Luke chapter 2, verse 52. So what we're going to do in this session, really quickly, is think about the idea of growing on purpose. And then if you're with me this afternoon, I know some people may have to go, we're going to think about growing for purpose. So one of the things that I've discovered is that there's a lot of conversation today about self-leadership. And we tend to think about self-leadership as being a sort of an idea that's been imported into the church from a secular context. And nothing could be further from the truth. The Bible is profoundly invested into the idea of leading yourself. Now, the Christian community, probably the Judeo-Christian worldview, has a gorgeous dynamic here in that much of our spirituality is located in community, in that me and you learn to be followers of Jesus by being in community. So actually, a lot of the language of the New Testament is plural, and a lot of that language is about me and you understanding that if I'm going to be a dynamic follower of Jesus, there's a sense in which I can only be that dynamic follower when I am invested into the community around me, the community of faith, and from that community of faith to others. So there is a dynamic us in the Scriptures, okay, which is very, very important. But at the same time, there is also a huge responsibility on the individual to think about their own heart, to think about their own growth, and to think about their own development. So I've had the privilege of being in Christian ministry full-time. What we mean by that is I earn enough money for it to be my living, right? So, and if you're a Christian, then you're in ministry full-time, whether you're paid to do it or not, right? So I understand that. But I've had the privilege of working for Jesus full-time for almost 37 years. And my biggest challenge in those 37 years has been me. Not the devil, not you, me. In fact, leading myself continues to be one of the greatest consistent challenges I have. And actually, if we're not careful, we can spend a lot of time trying to lead other people, trying to help them, but the Bible really talks a lot about us leading ourselves and being intentional about thinking about how we grow and deliberately positioning ourselves towards that. That's a strong biblical idea. Solomon says, above all else. When somebody says above all else in the Scriptures, you should pay attention, right? Above all else, guard your heart. Watch over, be diligent in the care of your heart, because it is the wellspring of life. And so there's a sense in which the community can help me with that. You can help me with that. There's another sense in which I am responsible for that. Because last night I was in my hotel room on my own. You weren't there, right? So there are certain things that I need you to help me with, and there are other things I've got to learn to grow up in. Are you with me? So that when you're not around, when my wife's not around, when my pastor's not around, when my friends aren't around, there's some dynamic commitments within me, disciplines within me that are about growing me towards Jesus. Does that make sense to you? That's sort of the essence of what we are talking about. And I've been profoundly changed by this conversation around Luke 2:52, and hopefully I'm going to give you a wee snapshot of it over the next 2 sessions. Hopefully it will help and inspire you. So if you've got a Bible with you, I'm going to read from Luke chapter 2, funnily enough. So here we go. Luke chapter 2, and we'll read from verse 41. And it says these words: every year his parents, or Jesus' parents, went up to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom. After the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. His mother said to him, verse 48, when his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. And in verse 21, chapter 3, when all the people were being baptized, Jesus was baptized too. And as he was praying, heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." Now Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph. Now, at the end of chapter 2 of Luke, we are told a potentially profound statement. As Jesus, the 12-year-old boy, is leaving Jerusalem to return to his home in Nazareth, where he will spend the next 18 years before beginning his ministry at the age of 30, Dr. Luke drops in a phrase that no other gospel writer gives us. Now, I know you'll know this, so please forgive me if I'm teaching my granny how to suck eggs here. So, when we read the Gospels and the Gospel writers all talk about the same story, it's really important we pay real attention to that story. Because that story for all four writers is so significant that independently they want to talk about this. And they'll all talk about that story slightly differently because they're wanting to give their insights and revelation on that story to us, building a beautiful 4-part composite picture of that story. Are you with me? So all four gospel writers, for example, talk about Gethsemane, right? So each of them will say something slightly different, but when we listen to them individually, then put them all together, wow, something amazing gets built. And I know you know that as a principle, as a way forward. The other flip side of that is equally as exciting. When you read the Gospels, and gospel writers drop in unique stories that no other gospel writer has, it's important we stop and pay attention to that as well. Why? Because that particular gospel writer is saying something, number one, that no one else has said, and number two, they're trying to portray something of Jesus in a way that no one has seen before or heard before. So when you read Matthew and Matthew drops in a unique story, stop and pause and ask, why is Matthew giving us that? Luke doesn't give that. John doesn't give that. Mark doesn't give that. Why is Matthew doing that? And if you keep asking those sorts of really good questions as you read the Gospels will become electrifying. I personally believe that most Christians are lazy when it comes to the Gospels. And if we're not careful, we sort of see the Gospels as like the story of Jesus, like rehashed 4 times. It's essentially the same story told in 4 different ways. And that is a really lazy approach. It's 4 dynamically inspired writers who are applying at many levels, genius level writing to the story of Jesus. Like unbelievable levels of genius coming to the story of Jesus. And they are dropping amazing ideas into the text. Because it's not just a story they're telling. They are investing themselves into profound theology that helps us to understand who Jesus is. And some of the work they're doing, some of the heavy lifting they're doing, hidden in plain sight, is staggering. It's staggering. And I urge Christians, so let me speak about myself. And as part of my everyday readings of the Bible, I constantly rotate the Gospels. There's never a day in my life where I'm not engaging with the Gospels. And here's why. Because the Gospels contain almost in their entirety the recorded words of Jesus. So if we want to engage with Jesus, in terms of his actual spoken words, the Gospels are the go-to place. But also, the Gospels are the very bedrock of the idea of the biblical story that links us back into Tanakh, the Old Testament, and propels us forward into the writings of the New Testament. The Gospels are the glue that pulls both sides of the text together. Everything revolves around the red letters of Jesus. Everything revolves around the Gospels. They are magnificent documents. And as followers of Jesus, we should be reading Jesus. Amen? And I meet a lot of beautiful Christians and are not really reading Jesus. And we need to be reading Jesus because we are followers of Jesus. Amen? Does that make sense to you? So, Dr. Luke gives us a unique piece of text. The story we've just read about Jesus in the temple is unique. No other gospel writer has that. So, if we're following our little pattern, we should be asking, why does he drop that story in? And is there anything that he's dropping into that story that we should be paying extra special attention to? And this verse is the climax of this temple experience. After this verse is given to us, 252, Jesus disappears for 18 years, and then he comes back and starts his ministry at the age of 30. So this is the last recorded words of the actions of Jesus as a 12-year-old boy before he disappears out of the text for 18 years and then comes back as the Jesus we know in the Gospels, okay? And in fact, this is the only insight we have to what I call the hidden years of Jesus explicitly. We've got other clues in the Gospel text, but in terms of specific things that Jesus does, Luke is helping us here in this amazing way. And he tells us this, that as Jesus is disappearing over the horizon back towards Nazareth from this incredible experience in Jerusalem, that Jesus grew. He grew in wisdom, he grew in stature, he grew in favor with God, and he grew in favor with men. And this is profoundly important because 252 links to 321. 321, there's Jesus standing in the Jordan. There's Jesus about to be filled with the Holy Spirit. There's Jesus about to receive the words of the Father. And Jesus is about to begin a ministry that will change the world forever. But what does Jesus do between his temple experience as a 12-year-old and beginning his ministry as a 30-year-old? What does he do? Luke tells us. He grew. He grew in wisdom. He grew in stature. He grew in favor with God, and he grew in favor with men. In other words, Luke is telling us this. If we follow the breadcrumbs that Luke's laying down, he's telling us this. The Jesus you see standing in the Jordan didn't just arrive. He hasn't just dropped down out of heaven from a spaceship, fully formed. The Jesus you see about to begin his ministry is there because for the last 18 years, when you haven't been looking, he's been growing. And the Jesus we see ministering to the broken and bringing the kingdom of heaven has been a Jesus who's been growing in Nazareth out of the view of public domain for the last 18 years. And this is a profound principle for us as followers of Jesus that, forgive me now, please don't be offended by what I'm about to say. If Jesus had to grow, in order to fulfill the will of the Father, and Jesus was God in flesh, then there is a responsibility on me and you as followers of Jesus, and especially as followers of Jesus who have a desire or a call to lead other followers of Jesus. There is a responsibility on us, a mandate on us to be like Jesus and to grow. And actually, there is a sense in which, even with the call of God on our lives, we have to be men and women that grow. So let me break this idea down for you, and hopefully it will make sense. First big idea I want you to see is this, in terms of growing on purpose, that growth starts with posture, a mentality. Now look at this. Let me break this down for you. In our English Bible, it says Jesus grew. And what it looks like on the surface of is it's just a statement of fact. Luke is telling us the 12-year-old Jesus grew, and then suddenly, 21 verses later, we meet the 30-year-old Jesus. And so yeah, okay, of course he grew. It's a natural thing, right, to grow. But Luke's doing a little bit of heavy lifting in this word, which is truly, truly profound. In fact, if you read something like the NIV version of the Bible, which I tend to work off in my everyday devotions, it's the third time we've come across the word to grow in the text in the Gospel of Luke. The first time we have this is in chapter 1, verse 80. And it says, the child grew and became strong in spirit. The child there is John. Okay, John who becomes John the Baptist. And then in chapter 2, verse 40, it's almost identical phrase with the exception of the in spirit bit. And the child grew and became strong. The child there in 2:40 is Jesus. If in doubt, the answer is always Jesus or the Bible, right? Okay, so Jesus grew as a child. And then the third reference in the NIV version of the Bible is 2:52. Now, if you've got something like the English Standard Version, the English Standard Version tries to show you Luke shifts gear here and introduces a different idea. The danger of our English Bible, it all looks like the same word being used here, and actually, Luke's doing something truly amazing. In chapter 2, verse 40, and in chapter 1, verse 80, he's using a particular word for grow. The word there is oxano, and it points to natural growth. It points to the idea that if someone is fundamentally healthy and they take care of themselves and you feed them and water them, they'll grow. Okay? So that's sort of the idea behind 180 and 240, a natural sense of growth. When Luke talks about Jesus growing in 252, he introduces a brand new word to his text. The word in the Greek language is prokopto. Compound word, two words jammed together. Pro, forward, kopto, to cut. What does that mean? Hard word to sort of define in English. But the idea here is of prokopto, of cutting something forward. Let me give you a picture which might help, which sort of, I think, describes the word pretty well. So here's a pathway. Now, a lovely little circle of grass has been planted there in the park. And normal people will walk round the pathway, right? But somebody has thought, that looks like a long way to go around that circle. Let's save a little bit of time, 0.3 of a second, perhaps, and we'll cut a new path. And so what someone has done is they have prokoptoed. They have made a decision that in order to get to the other side, they will cut a new path. Now, they may have done that just with their feet. They've just trampled it down. And then somebody else goes, oh, a path's been cut. I'll just trample it down. And then before we know it, we have what looks like an actually designed path. But that was not there at the beginning. That was all grass at the beginning. That's been something someone cut. So in order to get to the other side, they have cut a new path. That's the image behind the word. And Dr. Luke does another little bit of heavy lifting in the word, which isn't obvious in the English. The way he parses the word, tenses the word, it means that Jesus didn't just cut forward once, but he cuts forward continuously. So he says this, Jesus grew. Jesus deliberately, intentionally, and continuously cut towards certain ideas. And in this context, he cuts towards wisdom, he cuts towards stature, he cuts towards favor with God, and he cuts towards favor with men. In other words, Luke is dropping something really heavy here, something really amazing in the words. He says that when you look at Jesus in Luke chapter 3, verse 21, about to be filled with the Spirit, receiving the word of the Father, and going into his ministry, he is there because for the last 18 years, he has deliberately, intentionally, and continuously grown towards certain ideas. Are you with me? Now, this is so important, not only for a dynamic understanding of the incarnation, but also for a dynamic understanding of discipleship. So, for our understanding of the incarnation, this is really huge in that we believe, at least I believe as a Christian, that Jesus was 100% God, very God of very God, as the Westminster Confession would put it, and also at the same time, 100% human. Now, if that doesn't make your head hurt, you're not thinking about it right. The incarnation should make your head hurt. It should set our hearts on fire, but make our heads hurt. Now, here's the reason it should make your head hurt. It's because there is nothing in your brain, and nothing in your experience, and nothing in your intellect that can possibly work that out. The incarnation has had theologians engaged in profound conversations for 21 centuries. Millions of words have been written about the incarnation, and we sort of still understand, like we understand the mechanics, but we're still like slightly mind blown by the whole thing. Now here's the mystery of the incarnation. God knows all things, and Jesus grew in wisdom. What? There was a day when Jesus went to the Bet Midrash, the house of learning, and as a little boy, picked up a pencil for the first time and wrote the letter Aleph. A in Hebrew. Now here's the mystery. He invented Aleph. He is Aleph and Tau. He is Alpha and Omega. He's first and last. He's the God we talked about in the first session. He's the creator of the universe. He's the one building the woman out of the man. He's the one shaping the man out of the dust. He was there at the beginning. He knows all things. And yet he sat in a synagogue one day and had to literally learn the Hebrew alphabet. Jesus wrote the Bible, but he had to learn the Bible. Come on. Jesus creates and sustains the universe by the word of his power, and yet he had to grow in his physical stature. Jesus is God, and yet he had to grow in favor with God. What? Jesus made humanity, and yet he had to grow in favor with humanity. These are incredible ideas, but the point Dr. Luke is trying to get us to think about, like no other writer gets us to think about, is Jesus doesn't just arrive and have a shortcut and a get out of jail card and a skip to go card because he's God. Jesus has to grow just like every other person has to grow. And Jesus surrenders himself to the restrictions of humanity in the most mysterious and glorious way. So this is an important idea for the incarnation that really should excite us and really should encourage us, even if it makes our head melt a little bit. But this is also profoundly important for our discipleship. Listen to me. I meet so many beautiful Christians constantly looking for shortcuts, constantly looking for the fast route to success, constantly looking, what's the least I have to do to become something, to become someone. And this is an alien concept in the Bible. God's dealing with people. He's never in a rush. He's always about making sure that before we get to that moment of baptism, before we get to that moment of commissioning, before we get to that moment of fulfilling the purpose he has for us, that we have properly cooked, that we are ready for those moments. And just as Jesus had to go through a growing process, so do we. So this Luke 2:52 is powerful as a discipleship tool. Been revolutionary for me. This was an eye-opening moment. I had to study the Luke text for a class I was taking in Bible college. And because of that, I had to sort of work the language of Luke a bit harder than I'd ever looked before. And it was when I was doing that, I saw this incredible moment that Luke is introducing a new idea. And he's saying that Jesus didn't just grow naturally, but he grew intentionally, and he grew continuously. And my encouragement to me and you is that is just something that we've got to lock down. That me and you need to be men and women who understand that growing on purpose means it's going to be deliberate decisions and actions towards certain things. We'll talk about what they are in the next session. But it's also going to be a continuous journey towards something. Now, let me say this. When no one was looking, Jesus grew, so that when everybody was looking, Jesus was ready. The Jesus we see ministering to the broken is ready to do that, because when nobody was paying attention to him, in the little backwater place of Nazareth, he was getting up every day and growing. Wow, I love that. Such an encouragement to me. Such an encouragement to me in my own journey, that actually when people aren't paying attention, me and you can still be growing. And actually this just commitment to intentional, continuous growth. That's a posture. That's a mentality that me and you, as followers of Jesus, have just got to settle. And I want to thank God for the revelation in my own life that settled this years and years and years ago, where I just came to an understanding that whatever Jesus is calling me to, and whatever gifts Jesus has given me, whatever all of that looks like, my responsibility is not to manage the future. That's God's job. My responsibility is not to manufacture the gifts inside me. That's God's job. My responsibility is to take those gifts and grow towards the things that God wants me to move towards, and to do that in an intentional and continuous way. And the beauty and challenge of this is it never ends. So until the day we wake up and the trumpet blows and Jesus calls us, either from the grave or from our lives, and we end up in eternity with him, me and you are called to grow. And my growth is not primarily your responsibility, although you can help me. Your growth is not primarily my responsibility, although I can help you, community, that us stuff. But actually, as Jesus now teaches us, our growth is our personal responsibility to make a decision that I'm going to grow intentionally and continuously. Does that make sense to you? So the idea of lifelong learner wasn't invented by some cool coach in the secular world. Lifelong learner is a biblical idea modeled and exampled and championed by Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate lifelong learner. Come on. And we've got in 252 an amazing, amazing model. Jesus grows in wisdom, intellectual growth, stature, physical growth, favor with God, spiritual growth, favor with men, emotional growth. That can't be a coincidence. Seriously. That's a holistic growth program. Intellect, physical, spiritual, emotional. Wow. And Jesus is modeling that in Luke 2:52. And I think Luke 2:52 is one of the most amazing, hidden in plain sight verses in the whole of the Gospels. I really do. In my upbringing, no one ever talked about this. I was never taught this in Bible college. This was something that was a revelation to me. I saw this verse probably 25 years ago, and it was literally like something fell out of the sky and hit me on the head. And I remember saying in my study, how have I never seen that before? And part of the reason might be because we honor Jesus so much as God that we don't often take seriously his growth as a man. And maybe we know it's there, but we haven't really thought about it. And yet Jesus' growth as a man is truly spectacular. Truly spectacular. That he grows in those moments. Okay, let me just say a second thing. And now we started slightly late. Do I still have 45 minutes or not? Well, how are we doing? Okay, so I'll just take another 10 minutes. Is that okay? I'm supposed to finish at 1:45, but I'm not going to make it. But we did start about 5 or 10 minutes late. Is that okay? You all right? Okay, great. If you get into trouble, it's my fault. All right. Okay, so look at this. Growth works through process. Now, I want you to see something that's really spectacular here in the context of this. So just before we get to Luke 2:52, we have, funnily enough, Luke 2:51. And Luke 2:51 says this, he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. Now, again, on the surface, this just looks like a piece of information. Luke's just given us, okay, Jesus went back to Nazareth and he just carried on his life. That's what it looks like. But when you put 251 together with 252, a dynamic series of ideas potentially starts to kick out. Let me show you those for your interest in further study. First of all, he returned to Nazareth. Now, we're used to the idea of Nazareth in the 21st century because we hear it a lot in the gospel story. I've been to Israel twice and I've visited Nazareth 3 times. In fact, I've walked from Nazareth all the way to Capernaum. I've done what's known as the Jesus Trail. Sounds very religious. It was just a really cool walk. Okay, but I've taken 4 days with my family to walk from Nazareth all the way to Capernaum, a route that Jesus probably would have trailed many, many times. Nazareth in the first century world was a nowhere place. And of course, if you know the Jesus story, you'll know it's a nowhere place without realizing you know that. Because when Joseph returns with Jesus and Mary back to Israel after fleeing to Egypt, he finds out that Herod's son is in charge, and Herod's son was even more nasty than Herod himself. When the Romans get rid of you because you're nasty, you know you're really nasty, right? So they got rid of Archelaus and put Pilate in place. When Joseph, Mary, and Jesus return and find out Archelaus is ruling, what does Joseph do? He takes Jesus to Nazareth. Why? Because Nazareth is nowhere. It's estimated by scholars that less than 300 people lived in Nazareth at the time of Jesus. We've worked that out from the burial plots that are in the locality. If you ever go to Israel, go to Nazareth and go to the Nazareth experience. It's well worth a visit. Less than 300 people live in Nazareth. To get to Nazareth, you've got to go up over a hill and down into a valley. Really hard to get to. Really difficult. It's off the main trading route of its day. It's a nowhere place. In modern speak, we might say, it doesn't have a postcode. It doesn't have a zip code. It's a nowhere place. In fact, if you found a coffee shop in the first century world and got some Wi-Fi and went on Google and said, Nazareth, Google would say, where's that? I don't know where that is. It's a place of absolute nothingness. And it's a place of nothingness deliberately. I've been to the Nazareth experience, and they've rebuilt the synagogue there that Jesus would have done one of his first great, amazing sermons from Luke 4. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. That synagogue is just about the size of this group of chairs. You're a hard crowd to impress. I thought that was pretty amazing. Now, when we read Luke chapter 4, we're given the impression Jesus is speaking to like thousands of people. When Jesus unrolls the scroll of Isaiah in Luke chapter 4, he's probably speaking to less than 100 people squeezed into a synagogue. His synagogue, his little synagogue, the size of this seating block just here. It's a nowhere place. John, what's the point of all of this? The point is this, ladies and gentlemen, that Jesus did his greatest growing in a nowhere place. And one of the lessons we've got to help ourselves with and help disciples with that we're teaching is this. Growth is more about who you are than where you are. You can be in the best postcode in the world and not grow. I've met Christians who are sitting on top of unbelievable levels of resource in brilliant churches, and all they do is moan. Well, worship wasn't very good, preacher was a bit long, aircon was a bit cold, lights were a bit bright. Oh, for goodness sake, come over here, right? They're sitting on top of incredible resource, and yet, forgive my language, they're spiritual pygmies. They're just not growing. And then I've met other Christians, and maybe some represented by this wonderful young man that spoke to us today, who are in resource-starved scenarios. And they're growing. Growth is not about where you are. So stop making where you are an excuse. Well, if I lived in your postcode, John, my life would be different. I'm not so sure. Because if you move to my postcode, here's your problem. You're still you. Your postcode's changed, but you haven't. Listen, if your postcode changes but you don't change, you're not growing. You still love me? Does that make sense to you? And I've met a lot of people over the years, and they use where they are as the excuse. Now, I don't mean that. I mean, that can be literally use where they are. But what I mean is they use the moment they're in as the excuse as to why they're not growing. Now, are there important mitigating factors in your world? There are, and I'm not ignoring those at all. So do not hear what I am not saying. But the factors around you are not the determining factors for you. If Jesus can grow in Nazareth, you can grow where you are. Come on now. Come on now. In fact, if Jesus wants to be a top scholar, he really shouldn't be going to Nazareth. All the best schools were down south. All the best schools. It's hard for a northerner to say. All the best schools were down south. Right? Come on. All the best schools were down south. All the best schools were in Jerusalem. Paul was schooled under Gamaliel. Gamaliel would never have set up school in Nazareth. What? Nobody woke up in the first century world and went, let's move to Nazareth. Anyone who lived in Nazareth generally wanted to leave it. And yet Jesus grew in Nazareth. And the Jesus you see changing the world grew in a world without a postcode. Come on now. Some of you, I can tell from your reaction, you don't like that, and you don't like this, maybe this teaching. But listen to me. Stop making excuses. Stop making excuses for where you are, because growth is not about where you are. It's about who you are. It's a posture. It's not a place. And you can grow. Even in that church that you're not enjoying very much, you can grow. Even in that job that is, you know it's not the job for your life, but it's where you are, you can grow. Even in that street, you'd rather live somewhere else, but that's where you are. You can grow there. Even in the surroundings you're in, you can grow there. You can, if you want to. If you want to, and that's what Jesus teaches us. But look at the second thing. And we don't like this one so much. If you didn't like the first bit, you definitely won't like this bit. So look at this. He was obedient to them. It's a really heavy lifting word in the language of Luke. Luke, this word is hupotasso. To be under orders. Wow. And Luke is really interesting here. He describes Jesus as the boy Jesus. So probably at 12, Jesus hadn't had his bar mitzvah yet. So he's still a boy in the words and the language and culture of the Jews of his world. When he gets his bar mitzvah, he moves from boy to man, skips out teenager completely. Woohoo! What a great idea. Come on, let's buy into that. He skips out teenager, becomes a man overnight, as a woman would become having her bat mitzvah, son of the law, daughter of the law, right? So Jesus is described here still as a boy, but look at this. He was obedient to them. In other words, he returned to an ordinary world, and he committed himself to the challenges of that ordinary world. He didn't try to escape the challenge of his everyday world. He embraced it. And I want you to see that in those 18 years, Jesus does two amazing things. He excels in an ordinary place. He excels. He doesn't just get through, he excels. He comes to the place where he's ready to do the ministry that he's called to, and he embraced his responsibility. And we know this because he also not only is outstanding in the scriptures, but he becomes a tecton. He becomes a carpenter stonemason. Probably somewhere in these 18 years, Joseph dies and Jesus resumes the responsibility of the eldest son to look after the family. And so Jesus embraces the responsibility of taking care of the family, and therefore is probably having to study the scriptures under the oil lamp or extra hours down at the house of learning at the synagogue, because he's embracing his responsibility. And I love this. I love this idea. Listen to me carefully. Process doesn't take us to the purpose of God. Process is the purpose of God. We tend to see process as something that's taking me somewhere. The danger with that is we're sort of ignoring the now of the process. That there's something going on now. There's something going on right at this moment. There's something going on in me. There's something going on that Jesus wants to do in me and for me and through me right now in the process, right now in that job, right now in that street, right now in that situation. Something's going on. It's not just taking me somewhere that eventually will be my destiny, but the process, can I say this carefully? Difficult language. The process is my destiny. Now, you may not like this, but let me say this. When Jesus got up and cut the stone and put the stone in a wall, that was as much the purpose of God for his life as when he stood on a hillside and said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, we don't think that. Most of you might be, don't think I agree with that, don't think I like that. That's because we're seeing process as something that's taking us to purpose. Whereas I believe Jesus saw process as purpose itself. And when we understand that the Lord is invested into the everyday, then we invest into the everyday. We invest into the ordinary. We invest into the routine. We invest ourselves into the cutting of the stone, knowing that eventually there will be a day when I won't be cutting stones, I'll be preaching sermons. We invest ourselves into that job, knowing that it's not my job for life, but actually it's where I am right now. We invest ourselves into that local church, even though it may not be the church I'm going to be part of forever, or maybe one day Jesus will call me to lead a church, or whatever. And the danger is we ignore the stone cutting moment, we ignore the table building moment, because, well, that's not really my purpose. My purpose is ultimately to save the world. But I believe that Jesus embraced the ordinary moments in those growing challenges, so that then when he stood on the mountainside, he was ready to serve the purposes of the Father. The 18 years of Jesus' ministry life between 252 and 321 is truly awesome. We rarely talk about it. We rarely think about it, because there's a lot of gaps in there that we're not quite sure what goes on. But what Luke tells us is we know for sure he grew in those 18 years. And what's an incredible idea is that Jesus spends 91% of his life preparing for 9% ministry. Now, we live in a world that wants to flip that. 9% of preparation for 91% ministry. Now, I'm not saying that's a fixed number. Of course not. Of course not. What I'm saying is it's a fixed principle. That actually wherever Jesus wants to take me and you, it will require that right where you are, right where we live, right where we worship, right where we serve, right here, right now, we are called to invest ourselves, to embrace that, to understand that right here, right now, the process you're in is not just taking you somewhere, but it is doing something in me. It's doing something in you. It's building something in us. It is part of the somewhere. It's part of making us into everything that he wants us to be. And I love this as an idea. I love this as a challenge. I love this as a principle of discipleship. That actually we continue to encourage our own hearts that whatever the Lord has for us in the future, the right here, right now, the process we're in can be invested with purpose if we understand that right here, right now, where we are, is an opportunity to grow on purpose. And when no one was looking, Jesus grew, so that when everybody was looking, Jesus was ready. I don't know where you are. I don't know what your life looks like. I don't know if you're enjoying the moment or you're not. But I know this, that if you and I can embrace the spirit of 252 and understand that wherever we are, he is with us, And whatever the moment is, He wants to do something in us and through us for it. Then every moment, every opportunity, every context, every postcode can be an opportunity for you and I to grow on purpose for the glory of God. Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, favor with God, favor with men. He grew intentionally, and He grew continuously. And as His followers, we're called to follow after Him. Amen?